Now, introduction. What is cognitive linguistics? Cognitive linguistics is taken here to refer to the approach to the study of language that began to emerge in the 1970s and has been increasingly active since the 1980s. Now endowed with the International Society with biennial conferences and a journal, Cognitive Linguistics. A quarter century later, a vast amount of research has been generated under the name of cognitive linguistics. Most of the research has focused on semantics, but a significant proportion also is devoted to syntax and morphology, and there has been cognitive linguistic research into other areas of linguistics such as language acquisition, phonology, and historical linguistics.
Now, this book can only outline the basic principles of cognitive linguistic approach and some of its major, more important results and implications for the study of language. Now, in this chapter, we briefly describe the major hypotheses of cognitive linguistics as we see them and how we will develop these hypotheses in the rest of the book. Now, we see three major hypotheses as guiding the cognitive linguistic approach to language. First, language is not an autonomous cognitive faculty. Second, grammar is conceptualization. Third, grammar of language emerges from language use.
Now, these three hypotheses represent a response by the pioneering figures in cognitive linguistics to the dominant approaches to syntax and semantics at the time, namely generative grammar and truth conditional or logical semantics. The first principle, that is, language is not an autonomous cognitive faculty, is opposed to generative grammar's well-known hypothesis that language is an autonomous, indeed innate, cognitive faculty or module separated from non-linguistic cognitive abilities. The second principle, grammar is conceptualization, is opposed to the truth conditional semantics, in which a semantic meta-language is evaluated in terms of truth and falsity relative to the world, or more precisely, a model of the world.
Now, the third, that is, knowledge of language emerges from language use, is opposed to reductionist theories, reductionist tendencies in both generative grammar and truth conditional semantics, in which maximally abstract and general representations of grammatical form and meaning are sought, and many grammatical and semantic phenomena are assigned to the periphery.
Now, generative grammar and truth conditional semantics are, of course, still vigorous research paradigms today, and so cognitive linguists continue to present arguments for their basic hypotheses as well as exploring more specific empirical questions of syntax and semantics within the cognitive linguistic paradigm. Some of these arguments will be presented in the course of this book. Here we describe in somewhat more detail the content of these three hypotheses and how they are manifested in the subsequent chapters. The first hypothesis is that language is not an autonomous cognitive faculty. The basic corollaries of this hypothesis are that the representation of linguistic knowledge is essentially the same as the representation of other conceptual structures, and that the processes in which that knowledge is used are not fundamentally different from cognitive abilities that human beings use outside the domain of language.
Now, the first corollary is essentially that linguistic knowledge, the knowledge of meaning and form, is basically conceptual structure. It is probably not difficult to accept the hypothesis that semantic representation is basically conceptual, though what that entails is a matter of debate. But cognitive linguists argue that syntactic, morphological, and phonological representation is also basically conceptual. This might appear counterintuitive at first. Sounds are physical entities, and ultimately so are utterances and their formal structure. But sounds and utterances must be comprehended and produced, and both of those processes involve the mind. Sounds and utterances are the input, an output of the cognitive processes that govern speaking and understanding.
Now, the second corollary is that the cognitive processes that govern language use, in particular the construction and communication of meaning by language, are in principle the same as other cognitive abilities. That is, the organization and retrieval of linguistic knowledge is not significantly different from the organization and retrieval of other knowledge in the mind, and the cognitive abilities that we apply to speaking and understanding language are not significantly different from those applied to other cognitive tasks such as visual perception, reasoning, or motor activity. Language is a distinct human cognitive ability, to be sure. From a cognitive perspective, language is the real-time perception and production of a temporal sequence of discrete, structured, symbolic units. This particular configuration of cognitive abilities is probably unique to language, but the competent cognitive skills required are not.
Now, the position is sometimes taken as a denial of an innate human capacity for language. This is not the case. It is only a denial of an autonomous, special purpose, innate human capacity for language. It is, of course, reasonable to assume that there is a significant innate component to general human cognitive abilities, and that some of those innate properties give rise to human linguistic abilities that no other species apparently has. However, innateness of cognitive abilities has not been a chief concern of cognitive linguists, who are more concerned with demonstrating the role of general cognitive abilities in language. The hypothesis that language is not an autonomous cognitive faculty has had two major implications for cognitive linguistic research. Much cognitive linguistic research has been devoted to elucidating conceptual structure and cognitive abilities as they are seen to apply to language, in the effort to demonstrate that language can be adequately modeled using just these general conceptual structures and cognitive abilities.
Now, part 1 of this book is devoted to explicating cognitive linguistic models of cognitive structure and the abilities. Second, cognitive linguists appeal, at least in principle, to models in cognitive psychology, in particular models of memory, perception, attention, and categorization. Psychological models of memory have inspired linguistic models of the organization of linguistic knowledge into frames or domains, Chapter 2, and grammatical knowledge in networks linked with taxonomic and other relations. See Chapter 10, 11, and in Part 3. Now, psychological models of attention and perception, especially Gestalt psychology, have led to the explication of many conceptualization processes in semantics. Chapter 3, and see also the next paragraph. Now, finally, psychological models of categorization, in particular prototypes and graded centrality, are more recent and more recent models of category structure have had perhaps the greatest influence on both semantic and grammatical category analysis in cognitive linguistics. See Chapter 3, see Lakoff 1987, Taylor 1989.
Now, the second major hypothesis of the cognitive linguistic approach is embodied in Langaker's slogan, "Grammar is conceptualization." This slogan refers to a more specific hypothesis about conceptual structure, namely that conceptual structure cannot be reduced to a simple truth conditional correspondence with the world. A major aspect of human cognitive ability is the conceptualization of the experience to be communicated, and also the conceptualization of the linguistic knowledge we possess. A major theme of the chapters in part 1 of this book is that all aspects of conceptual structure and subject are subject to construal, including the structure of categories, chapter 4, and the organization of knowledge, that is conceptual structures, in chapter 2. In particular, it is argued that grammatical inflections and grammatical constructions play a major role in construing the experience to be communicated in specific ways, chapter 3.
Now, part 2 of this book also explores and defends the conceptualization hypothesis for a wide range of lexical semantic phenomena, including topics widely discussed in cognitive linguistics like polysemy and metaphor, and lexical semantic topics that have not generally been examined by the cognitive linguists, namely lexical relations such as antonymy, meronymy, and hyponymy. The third major hypothesis of the cognitive linguistic approach is that knowledge of language emerges from language use, that is, categories and structures in semantics, syntax, morphology, and phonology are built up with our cognition of specific utterances on specific occasions of use. This inductive process of abstraction and schematization does not lose the conventionalized subtleties and differences found among even highly specific grammatical constructions and word meanings.
Now, as we noted above, this hypothesis is a response to approaches to syntax and semantics in which highly general and abstract schemas and categories, sometimes claimed to be innately given, are assumed to govern the organization of linguistic knowledge, and apparently idiosyncratic or anomalous patterns are relegated to the periphery. Instead, cognitive linguists argue that the detailed analysis of subtle variations in syntactic behavior and semantic interpretation give rise to a different model of grammatical representation that accommodates idiosyncratic as well as highly general patterns of linguistic behavior. See, for example, the arguments in chapter 9.
Now, in semantics, this model is manifested in Fillmore's Semantics of Understanding, chapter 2, and Cruz's dynamic construal approach to categorization, chapter 4 and part 2. See also Croft, 2000. In syntax, this hypothesis has given rise directly to construction grammar as a new theory of syntax and the usage-based model developed in greatest detail for morphology and phonology. These models of syntax and morphology are described in part 3.
Now, part 1, a conceptual approach to linguistic analysis. Frames, domains, spaces, the organization of conceptual structure. Let's talk about that. Arguments from frame semantics. Now, what is it that words denote or symbolize? As cognitive linguists usually put it, a simple assumption that has guided much research in semantics is that words denote concepts, units of meaning. Concepts symbolized by words such as stallion and mare can be compared and contrasted with one another.
You're right. Comparisons of words is the approach taken by structural semantics, which analyzes types of semantic relations among words, including hyponymy and antonymy. Now, some approaches to lexical semantics have proposed that word concepts such as stallion and mare are not atomic. Now, as a footnote, here we follow practice of Fillmore and Langacker, 1982 and 87 respectively, in using lowercase italics to represent the word form and capitals to represent the concept underlying the word meaning.
Now, many concepts can be broken down into semantic features, so that stallion is a queen male and mare is a queen female. Finally, in the logical tradition that underlies much work in semantics, concepts are ultimately defined by their truth conditions. The conditions under which one can say that a concept does or does not appropriately apply to a situation in the world. Now, in this widespread approach in semantics, it is recognized that concepts do not simply float around randomly in the mind. First, there are the relations between words and their corresponding concepts described by structural semantics.
But there has been a strong feeling that concepts are organized in another way as well. Certain concepts belong together because they are associated in experience. To use a classic example, a restaurant is not merely a service institution. It has associated with it a number of concepts such as customer, waiter, ordering, eating, bill. These concepts are not related to restaurant by hyponymy, meronymy, antonymy, or other structural semantic relations. They are related to restaurant by ordinary human experience. The concept of restaurant is closely tied to the other concepts and cannot be isolated from the other concepts.
Now, the need for another means for organizing concepts has been felt by researchers in cognitive psychology and artificial intelligence, as well as in various branches of linguistics, and has led to a variety of similar proposals, each typically with its own name. Among these names are frame, schema, script, global pattern, pseudo-text, cognitive model, experiential gestalt, base, scene. Fillmore, 1985. The most influential version of this proposal in cognitive linguistics has been the model of frame semantics developed by Fillmore. We present Fillmore's theory and arguments in this section and turn to extensions of Fillmore's ideas by other cognitive linguists in the later sections.
Now, Fillmore views frames not as an additional means for organizing concepts, but as a fundamental rethinking of the goals of linguistic semantics. Fillmore describes his frame semantic model as a model of the semantics of understanding, in contrast to a truth conditional semantics, that is the full, rich understanding that a speaker intends to convey in a text and that a hearer constructs for that text. Fillmore argues that in the analysis of linguistic meaning, understanding is the primary data. Truth value judgments and judgments of semantic relations such as synonymy and implication are derivative and theory-driven. Fillmore's frame semantics brings linguistic semantics back to that primary data and does not include any of it from consideration.
Yes, Fillmore uses a tool metaphor to describe the understanding process. A speaker produces words and constructions in a text as tools for a particular activity, namely to evoke a particular understanding. The hearer's task is to figure out the activity those tools were intended for, namely to evoke that understanding. That is, words and constructions evoke an understanding, or more specifically, a frame. A hearer invokes a frame upon hearing an utterance in order to understand it. Fillmore uses a wide range of examples to demonstrate that there are significant phenomena in linguistic semantics that cannot be easily captured in a model of structural semantics, semantic features, and or truth conditional semantics. We surveyed his arguments here.
Now, the analysis of semantic features is often justified on the basis of lexical sets that appear to be analyzable in terms of a simple set of features. For example, the lexical set in 1 can be analyzed in terms of the features male or female, adult or young, and unmarried. Male adult is man, female adult is woman, male young is boy, female young is girl, male unmarried is bachelor, female unmarried is spinster.
Yet, our understanding of these concepts is more complex than this paradigm of feature contrasts implies. The relation between man or boy and woman or girl is not the same. For many people, the term girl is used for female humans at a significantly higher age than the term boy is used for male humans. Moreover, the attitude towards the sexes that this linguistic behavior is assumed to evoke has led to changes in the relationship and hypercorrection such that the term woman is attested as being applied even to an 8-year-old girl.
In frame semantics analysis, man, boy, woman, and girl evoke frames that include not just the biological sexual distinction, but also differences in attitudes and behavior towards the sexes that would explain the traditional asymmetry in the use of boy or girl and the more recent change in the use of women, including its hypercorrective use. Likewise, the difference between our understanding of bachelor and our understanding of spinster involves much more than a simple feature, male or female.
Now, many lexical contrasts contain semantic asymmetries that cannot be captured by features, except in an ad hoc fashion, but lend themselves easily to a frame semantic account. For example, the opposing terms used for the vertical extent of an erect human being are tall and short. For vertical distance from a bottom baseline, for example a branch of a tree, they are high and low. But for the vertical dimension of a building, they are tall and low. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to come up with a unitary feature definition of tall that captured its different contexts from use from high and did the same for short versus low. Instead, one can simply describe the frames for humans, buildings, and other objects and specify which words are used for vertical extent or distance in that frame.
Similarly, no simple unitary definitions would capture the contrast between the adjectives live and alive given in 2 to 4. 2a, those are live lobsters. 2b, those lobsters are alive. 3a, her manner is very alive. 3b, she has a very alive manner. 4a, his performance was live. 4b, he gave a live performance. Moreover, one cannot define the features in terms of applicability to a semantic class such that the sense illustrated in 2a to b applies to living things. This would give an incorrect understanding to the theater advertising live naked girls than the one intended, presumably as opposed to naked girls on a film screen, not dead naked girls.
Now, in a frame semantic analysis, live and alive are simply associated in different ways to 3 different frames. life in 2, that is, those lobsters are alive. Personality in 3, that is, her manner was very alive. And mode of performance in 4, that is, his performance was live. Now, in other cases that are outright lexical splits, such as brother versus brothers and brother or brethren, which represent a split in frames, including different plural forms, a unitary definition of brother would miss the frame contrast.
Fillmore notes that his frame semantic model shares significant properties with lexical or semantic field theory. Semantic field theory. Lexical field theory groups together words that are associated in experience, not unlike frame semantics. However, lexical field theory differs from frame semantics in that words are defined relative to other words in the same lexical field, whereas in frame semantics, words are defined directly with respect to the frame. For example, in lexical field theory, one would observe that large in the field of sizes of packages of soap flakes is in contrast with jumbo, economy giant, and family size, and hence describes the smallest size in the field, unlike uses of large in other lexical fields.
Now, in frame semantics, the same observation can be easily captured. Large labels the smallest size of in the soap flakes frame. But lexical field theory predicts that the meaning of a word in a field can only be defined in contrast to neighboring words in the field. Lexical field theory has difficulties if there are no neighboring words, or a speaker does not know the neighboring words. It predicts that the term has a different meaning. Fillmore notes that while German has a word for the sides of a right angle triangle other than the hypotenuse, namely cathete, most English speakers do not have such a word. Yet, the understanding of English hypotenuse and German hypotenuse is the same, provided the speaker understands what a right angle triangle is. This is not a problem in frame semantics, where the word concept is linked directly to the frame, in this case the right angle triangle frame.
Now, another argument in favor of frame-based approach to lexical semantics are words whose corresponding concepts inherently refer to other concepts, extrinsic to the concept denoted by the word. Some word concepts refer to a prior history of the entity denoted. A scar is not just a feature of the surface of someone's skin, but a healing state of a wound. A widow is a woman who was once married but whose husband has died. Other word concepts, especially for properties and actions, cannot be understood without understanding something about the participant in the action or possessor of the properties. One can understand gallop without knowing about the body of a horse. One cannot understand or hungry without understanding the physiology of living things. This is true of object concepts as well as lap cannot be understood except in reference to a person's posture and the function of one's lap in supporting another object.
Another clear class of examples that requires reference to extrinsic entities are deictic expressions that evoke the speech act situation. For example, the past tense situates an event in a point or interval or time relative to the speech act situation. The speech act situation, including its time of occurrence, functions as the frame against the past tense reference is profiled. Likewise, all other deictic words and inflections such as person deixis, I, you, he, she, it, we, they, and person-based agreement inflections and spatial deixis, this, that, here, there, evoke the speech act situation. Other types of grammatical words and inflections also have meanings evoking the speech act situation. For example, the definite articles the and a are define the identity of the noun referent relative to the mutual knowledge of speaker and hearer. The basically indicates mutually known. A, not mutually known in most contexts. The meanings of the and evoke the speech act situation because they make reference to the mental states of speaker and hearer.
Now, above all, many word concepts cannot be understood apart from the intentions of the participants or the social and cultural institutions and behavior in which the action, state or thing is situated. For example, the concept vegetarian only makes sense in a frame of a culture in which meat eating is common. The concepts strike or borrow can only be understood in the frame of a culture in which such actions occur. Even something as simple as an apple core evokes a frame describing a particular way of eating apples. An apple core is that part of the apple that somebody who eats apples the way most of us do has left uneaten.
Another aspect in which a word meaning makes reference to extrinsic entities is that a word allows the speaker and hearer to focus their attention on only part of an entire frame. No one word gives the full structure of the frame. The classic example is the commercial transaction frame. But a much clearer case is the risk frame. Fillmore and Atkins, 1992. Fillmore and Atkins identified the following elements of the risk frame. Chance, that is uncertainty about the future. Harm, victim of the harm. Valued object, that is potentially endangered by the risk. Situation, which gives rise to risk. Deed, that brings about the situation. Actor of the deed. Intended, gain, by the actor in taking a risk. Purpose of the actor in the deed. Beneficiary and motivation for the actor. The verb risk occurs in many syntactic constructions, some of which are exemplified in 5a to e, but none of them include all or even most of the elements of the risk frame.
Now 5a, you've risked your health for a few cheap thrills. 5b, others had risked all in the war. 5c, she had risked so much for the sake of vanity. 5d, men were not inclined to risk scalping for the sake of settlers they had never seen. 5e, I didn't dare risk a pause to let that sink in.
Now, frame semantic analysis, any of the uses of risk evokes the entire risk frame, even if only part of that frame is overtly focused on by the construction in which risk is used. The semantics of understanding also allows Fillmore to account for linguistic facts that do not lend themselves to a truth functional analysis. For example, the collocations in 6, that is, a dog was barking, 6b, a hound was baying. This could be reversed as in 7, 7a, a dog was baying, 7b, a hound was barking, without producing semantic anomaly.
In other words, the difference between 6 and 7 cannot be accounted for by semantic constraints. But the examples in 6a, b, that is, a dog was barking and a hound was baying, sound much more natural because the noun and the verb in each sentence both evoke the same frame.
Likewise, a truth conditional semantics cannot capture many aspects of our understanding of 8. That is, my dad wasted most of the morning on the bus.
Now, Fillmore notes that choosing father or dad without the possessive would express a different relationship between the speaker and the speaker's father. The morning is understood to be defined against the frame of the working day, that is around 8 a.m. to noon, rather than the calendar day, that is midnight to noon. My dad wasted most of the morning on the bus. Waste frames the use of time very differently from spent, and on the bus frames the speaker's location in terms of the bus being in service rather than simply a physical container which would be evoked by in the bus.
Now, a truth conditional model also cannot account for the anomaly of frames that are appropriate at one time of utterance but not at another, because the world has changed in the meantime. Fillmore uses the contrived example in 9, that is, during World War I, Ronald Reagan's birth mother dropped his analog watch into the sound hole of the acoustic guitar, noting that it could be said in 1984 but not in, say, 1919.
Now, such a sentence could be uttered in 1984 because World War II had occurred, allowing the 1914 to 1918 war to be renamed World War I. Medical technology had allowed the dissociation of the birth mother from the genetic mother who donates the egg, and electric guitars and digital watches had been invented. None of these framings of the objects, persons or events was available in 1919, and so 9, that is, during World War I, Ronald Reagan's birth mother dropped his analog watch into the sound hole of the acoustic guitar would be an impossible utterance at that time, even if true retrospectively.
Now finally, frame semantics offers a natural account of a number of problematic phenomena that seem to be caught between semantics and pragmatics, including the nature of text coherence. A large class of presuppositional phenomena appear to be tied to specific words, such as regret in 10, that is, John regretted signing the letter. Now, example 10 denotes or entails a particular mental state of John, namely his feeling of regret, but in one analysis is said to presuppose that John did sign the letter. The problem for truth conditional semantics is that if John did not sign the letter, 9, that is, during World War I, Ronald Reagan's birth mother dropped his analog watch into the sound hole of the acoustic guitar, it has no truth conditions. Now, in order to preserve truth conditions, one may shunt the presupposition problem of pragmatics.
Now this seems odd since the presupposition is associated with a particular word and its meaning, which is semantic. But presuppositions display a further type of peculiar behavior in negative sentences such as 11. John didn't regret signing the letter. Now, in one interpretation, the entailment is negated. John does not have any regrets. But the presupposition is not that John signed the letter. However, there is another interpretation of 11, namely that John did not regret signing the letter because he did not sign the letter at all.
Now, Fillmore argues that the behavior of presuppositions can be easily accounted for in frame semantic analysis. The concept regret includes in its frame the accomplishment of an action towards which the regretter has his or her regrets. If the action is absent from the frame, understanding of the positive sentence fails. Negation, on the other hand, can negate either the concept denoted or the frame itself. Negating the state of affairs in the frame preserves the rest of the frame, including the action that could have led to regrets. This is the first interpretation of 11 described above. Now, negating the entire frame, on the other hand, also negates the action that could have led to regrets. This is the second interpretation of 11. The speaker here denies the frame of the situation as including the action of John having signed the letter.
Now we may compare 11, that is, John didn't regret signing the letter, to other examples of frame negation, such as the one in 12. You didn't spare me a day at the seaside. You deprived me of one. Here, the speaker denies the positively evaluated framing of the action as sparing her and replaces it with a negatively evaluated framing of depriving her. Finally, the semantics of understanding plays a major role in text understanding. For example, the well-known example of initial definite reference, example, the carburetor in 13, that is, I had trouble with the car yesterday. The carburetor was dirty, which is described as bridging by Clark and Haviland and evoked by Prince, are in fact due to the frame evoked by the first sentence. So,
now, I had trouble with the car yesterday. The carburetor was dirty. The car in the first sentence evokes a frame that allows the hearer to identify which carburetor of the millions in the world the speaker was referring to. But frame semantics contributes more than the resolution of definite reference to the analysis of the coherence of texts. Fillmore contrasts 13 with 14. That is, I had trouble with the car yesterday, the ashtray was dirty. The second sentence in 14 is incoherent with the first, even though the definite reference can be resolved. Most cars have ashtrays. Now, the reason for this is that there is nothing evoked in the frame of having trouble with the car that has anything to do with the ashtray, unlike 13, because dirty carburetors do cause problems for cars.
now Fillmore's arguments present a wide range of data that justify the introduction of frames to the analysis of linguistic semantics and the replacement of a truth conditional semantics with a semantics of understanding. In the following sections, we lay out systematically the frame semantic model and follow its further development in cognitive linguistics. 2.2 Concepts, Profile Frame Organization. In the preceding section, we described the frame as a coherent region of human knowledge or as a coherent region of conceptual space. The question immediately arises: how does one identify a coherent region of conceptual space, differentiating it from other regions?
Now, an a priori approach to this question, using one's own intuitions to identify frames, would be highly subjective. A more empirical approach to this question is to identify frames based on words and constructions of a human language, such as English. This approach is taken by Langacker, 1987, which we will use as our starting point. Langacker illustrates his approach to the problem with the meaning of the word radius. The word form radius symbolizes, that is, denotes the concept radius. We begin here by assuming that concepts correspond to meanings of linguistic units, that is, words, complex expressions, or constructions. One may also assume that concepts exist that do not correspond to linguistic meanings. However, one would have the same problems trying to identify concepts independent of linguistic meanings as trying to identify frames independent of linguistic meanings, namely the lack of an empirical basis for doing so. For this reason, we will restrict ourselves to concepts corresponding to actual linguistic meanings in this chapter.
Now, the first sense for radius in the American Heritage Dictionary is a line segment that joins the center of a circle with any point on its circumference. A radius is a line segment, but not any line segment. The line segment is defined relative to the structure of the circle. In other words, one can understand radius only against the background understanding of the concept circle, which can be geometrically illustrated. And now, in other words, the concepts radius and circle are intimately related, and this relationship must be represented in conceptual structure. Langacker describes the relationship between radius and circle as one of a concept profile against a base. The profile refers to the concept symbolized by the word in question. The base is that knowledge or conceptual structure that is presupposed by the profiled concept. Langacker also uses the term domain for the base. This term is also used in Lakoff 1987. This is identical to Fillmore's frame. By the term frame, I have in mind any system of concepts related in such a way that to understand any one of them, you have to understand the whole structure in which it fits.
Now, the term profile has also come to be used as a verb to describe the relationship between word form and word meaning, that is, profile plus base. For example, radius profiles a particular line segment in the circle base or domain or frame. A concept profile is insufficient to define a word concept because it presupposes other knowledge in its definition, namely its base. But a single base, such as circle, is a complex conceptual structure that includes a wide range of concept profiles, such as radius, arc, center, diameter, chord, and so on. Hence, the base alone is insufficient to define a linguistic concept either. The conclusion that follows from this is that the meaning of a linguistic unit must specify both the profile and its base. This is identical to Fillmore's conclusion regarding concept frames.
Now, the fact that a base supports multiple concept profiles is what makes the base a domain. In the intuitive sense, several different concept profiles have it as a base. We can now define a domain as a semantic structure that functions as the base for at least one concept profile, typically many profiles. As Taylor in 1989 notes, in principle, any conceptualization of knowledge configuration, no matter how simple or complex, can serve as the cognitive domain for the characterization of meanings. We may now say that the domain circle includes the concepts of an arc, a diameter, a radius, a chord, and so on. Now
the canonical example of a profile-based relation is a part-whole relation, as all agree that a concept such as arm cannot be defined without reference to body. A similar class of concepts are kin terms such as daughter. The concept daughter presupposes the concept parent and the particular type of kin relationship that holds between them. The concept niece presupposes other kinship concepts and more complex kin relationships. In other words, the base against which a profile is defined can be more complex than just the whole of which some entity is a part. In some cases, one cannot always find a single simple word to describe the base. For niece, perhaps the best description of the base is kinship system or some part of that system.
But it is not only relational nouns that represent a concept profile against a base, as we saw in 2.1. Consider another example, the word weekend. The concept weekend can only be understood against a whole background system of the calendrical cycle, defined partly by natural phenomena, that is the sequence of day and night, and cultural conventions like the 7-day week cycle and its divisions into working days and non-working days. Likewise, the concept buy can only be understood against a background knowledge of the commercial transaction situation. Different aspects of commercial transaction are profiled by buy, sell, pay, cost, and so forth. Such domains or frames cannot be readily represented in a geometric form in the way that radius and circle are represented in figure 2.1. Although schematic diagrams are often resorted in cognitive linguistics in order to represent the complex interconnectedness of concepts in domains or frames.
In fact, no concept exists autonomously. All are understood to fit into our general knowledge of the world in one way or another. What matters for semantic analysis is the profile-based relation and the relationships between bases and domains. Some of the corollaries of this analysis of word meaning into profile and base or frame or domain will be explored in the following section. So 2.3, some consequences of profile, frame, or domain distinction. Now the terms frame, Fillmore, base, Langacker, and domain by Fillmore, Lakoff, and Langacker all appear to identify the same theoretical framework as described in the preceding sections. Fillmore describes this framework as frame semantics, and this term has entered into more general usage among the cognitive
linguists. However, the terms frame and domain continue to compete for usage, and base is also used among cognitive grammarians. We will use the terms frame and domain interchangeably here. Nevertheless, there are still other terms that have been proposed to describe types of semantic analyses that bear a strong affinity to frame semantics. We mention three influential theories here, which originated in artificial intelligence, that is scripts, in cognitive psychology, that is the theory, and sociology, that is communities.
Now, the examples of frames given above appear to be largely static in character, but this is not necessary. A frame is any coherent body of knowledge presupposed by a word concept. In particular, frames can include dynamic concepts, that is, extending through time. For example, purified presupposes in its frame a prior impure state of the entity which is then changed by some process. In contrast, pure does not presuppose anything about prior states and processes. Of course, process terms such as run or buy presuppose a sequence of events and prior and posterior states. The term script is often used for a frame or domain with a sequence of events. Following Shank and Abels in 1977, term script. They use the term to describe a canonical sequence of events presupposed by a social activity such as going to restaurant. We subsume scripts under frames or domains.
Now, another theoretical construct that can be understood as a type of frame or domain is the so-called theory of categorization found in cognitive psychology. Advocates of the theory argue that our understanding of the categories such as a horse or hammer is based not on perceptual features but on theories of biological kinds and artifacts respectively. For instance, we have at least a folk theory of biological kinds that indicates that individuals of the same category, for example horse, are members of that category by virtue of descent and reproduction, and perceptual similarity of horses and the distinctness of individuals of other species are a result of those basic biological patterns.
Yeah, true. Likewise, hammers are defined by the fact that they are manufactured by human beings for a particular function, and perceptual similarity of hammers and the distinctness of other kinds of artifacts are a result of their intended function. In frame semantic terms, the base for horse includes the theory of biological kinds, and the base for hammer includes the theory of artifacts.
Now, Fillmore also uses the notion of framing to describe differences in the community or social domain of use of a word. For example, he notes that in the legal domain, that is, the community that engages in legal activity, the concepts of murder and innocent differ from those concepts used outside that domain or community. In the legal domain, murder is profiled in a frame or domain where it contrasts with manslaughter, but outside that domain, murder is profiled in a domain lacking that contrast. In the legal domain, innocence is profiled against a frame in which innocence and guilt are the result of judgments in a trial, and in fact, guilt can be established only after the completion of the trial. Outside that domain, innocent is profiled against a frame in which innocence and guilt are defined by whether the person in question committed the crime or not. Other concepts such as flipped strength exist only in a specialized community. In this case, publishers of pornography, that is, the interested reader may turn to Fillmore.
Yes, and hence the frame semantics is being extended to describe differences that appear to be defined on social rather than the conceptual grounds. But there is a link between the two. Communities are defined by the social activities that bind the members together. Croft argues that communities involve the possession of shared expertise among their members, the specialized knowledge that is acquired by engaging in the activities that define the community.
Now, this shared expertise is the conceptual structure that is found in the frame or domains of the concepts symbolized by the specialized vocabulary used by the members of the community. The distinction between profile and frame domain is a useful tool for analyzing a number of interesting semantic questions. In particular, some distinctions in word meaning apply not to the profile concept, what is usually thought of as the definition of a word, but to its frame or domain.
Yeah, right. For example, some concepts appear to denote the same thing in the word, but profile it against a different frame. For example, land and ground denote or profile what seems to be the same thing, but against different frames. Land describes the dirty surface on the earth in contrast with sea, while ground describes the dry surface of the earth in contrast with air. Now the frame chosen by one word or another allows one to make different inferences. Fillmore notes that a bird that spends its life on land does not go in water, but a bird that spends its life on the ground does not fly.
Langacker offers the example of roe and caviar, both being fish eggs. Roe is profiled against the frame or domain of the reproductive cycle of fish, while caviar is profiled against the frame or domain of food preparation or consumption. Another example is flesh, profiled against the frame or domain of the body's anatomy, versus meat, profiled against the frame or domain of food. The semantic difference is reflected in the collocations flesh and bones, describing an emaciated body. The meat and potatoes describing a bland but filling type of meal, contrasting meat and bones and flesh and potatoes.
Now the alternative framing of the same profile is particularly common with terms that are evaluative in character. For example, stingy profiles one end of a scale, the opposite of which is generous, while thrifty appears to profile the same end of the same scale, and its opposite end is profiled by wasteful. The difference is the orientation of the associated evaluative scale. The evaluation of stingy generous is the inverse of that for thrifty wasteful. Of course, a speaker may choose to frame someone as either stingy or thrifty. In other words, how an experience is framed is a matter of construal. It depends on how the speaker conceptualizes the experience to be communicated. For the understanding of the hearer, this is only one example of the construals that pervade human conceptualization of experience.
Now another type of evaluating frame effect is more indirect, as in the example fetus versus unborn baby, terms used by opposing sides of the debate on abortion. Fetus profiles the entity in question against a more general mammal frame. Any mammal's unborn progeny may be called a fetus. This frame makes abortion appear really less morally repugnant, since it is widely accepted in society that animals can be killed for certain purposes. The complex phrase unborn baby exploits two frames. Baby profiles the same entity against the more specific human frame. We prototypically use baby only for human offspring. Both baby and unborn profile the entity against its projected later life stage, namely after birth. Now these frames make abortion appear more repugnant, since killing humans is only accepted under quite restricted circumstances, for example war and self-defense, and all agree that once a fetus is born, it is a human being. The difference in framing the entity denoted by fetus or unborn baby therefore orientates or biases to frame it differently. It orientates the hearer towards the political stance on abortion adopted by the speaker.
Now, in above examples, all illustrate different words that profile the same concept, but in subtly different frames. There are also examples where a single word is usually analyzed as polysemous, having albeit distinct, albeit related meanings, but where those meaning differences are more due to differences in frame rather than differences in profile. For example, a word such as mouth describes roughly the same concept profile but with different frames. 15. Mouth, that is body, bottle, cave, river.
Now, in the examples of frames for mouth in 15, mouth can be thought of as denoting the same type of profile, namely the opening to a container. However, a cave may have several openings to the earth's surface, and the container of a river is defined by both the riverbed and gravity. The word mouth is generally considered to be polysemous, that is, it has a sense for each of the profile-based pairings. Senses that may not share the same word in other languages. That's profile-based pairings. In other words, the profile alone is insufficient in defining the senses of mouth.
Now, the profile frame or domain distinction is particularly useful in understanding the nature of semantic differences between words and their apparent translation equivalents in different languages. The profile or frame domain distinction may shed light on some aspects of why translation is difficult and often unsuccessful.
Now, one can find frame-based semantic contrasts across languages that are similar to those found within a single language, such as land or ground. Fillmore contrasts the English word concept lukewarm with the Japanese word concept nurui. Both concepts profile the same state at room temperature, but for English speakers, lukewarm is used for liquids that are ideally hot or ideally cold, whereas for some Japanese speakers, nurui is used only for liquids that are ideally hot.
Now, sometimes linguistic differences across languages represent differences in how much information is specified in the frame, rather than something about the inherent structure of the profile concept. English river profiles a more or less permanent flow of water in a natural channel, presupposing a frame specifying the relevant topographical features. French contrasts rivière and fleuve. The concepts for both French words is essentially the same as the concept for the English word, a natural flowing waterway, but the frame is more specific than the English frame for each word. Fleuve specifies, in addition, that it is a major waterway that flows into the sea, unlike rivière. Hence, a translation of fleuve as river is partly accurate, that is the profile, but not completely so, that is its frame.
Yes, another example is English eat, which profiles the process of consuming food. German contrasts essen and fressen. Both describe the process of consuming food also, but the former specifies that the eater is human and the latter that the eater is an animal, that is non-human. This is a framing effect and is therefore subject to construal. That is, one can use the term fressen to describe the action of a human being, but in frames that action much differently than essen, leading to a construal of the action as being animal-like crude, sloppy, etc.
Now, the nature of word meaning across languages is sometimes obscured by analysts who do not distinguish between profile and frame in their word definitions. For example, some languages are described as having words that correspond to whole sentences in English. Two candidate examples are given in 1617. 16. Alabama is paspakahmit, means to be shaped into a patty, shaped like a biscuit, said of the shape of the mixture of brains and moss used for curing hides. Swedish tura, that is sitting on the boat going back and forth between Helsingborg and Helsingor. Now the first from the Native American language and the second from the European language.
Now, by distinguishing profile from frame or domain, we may give a more straightforward semantic analysis. The concepts profile are pretty simple. Ispapakahmit profiles a shape and tura profiles sitting. But the frames in which the concepts are situated are very specific. In 17, Swedish tura, sitting on the boat going back and forth between Helsingborg and Helsingor. That is, staying on the boat means paying only one fare and drinking duty-free alcohol. A similar English example would be genuflect. Genuflect profiles more or less the same concept as kneel, a body movement, but in a highly specific frame, namely Catholic religious practice. But even less culturally specific word concepts can be fruitfully divided into profile and frame. A radius profiles a line segment. The difference between radius and line segment is found in their frames.
Now the profile-frame distinction also allows for a natural analysis of words in languages that have been described as untranslatable in a more profound way than the examples of fluve and fressen given above. For example, Geertz gives a lengthy explanation of Javanese rus, part of which is quoted below. So tell me about the quotation.
Yes, the quotation rus has two primary meanings, feeling and meaning. As feeling, it is one of the traditional Javanese five senses, that is seeing, hearing, talking, smelling and feeling, and it includes within itself three aspects of feeling that our view of the five senses separates: taste of the tongue, touch of the body, and emotional feeling within the heart, like sadness and happiness. The taste of a banana is its rus. A hunch is a rus. A pain is a rus. And so is a passion. As meaning rus is applied to words in a letter, in a poem, or even in a common speech to indicate the between the lines type of indirection and elusive suggestion that is so important in Javanese communication and social discourse. And it is given this same application to behavioral acts generally to indicate the implicit import, the connotative feeling of dance movements, polite gestures, and so forth. But in this second semantic sense, it also means ultimate significance, the deepest meaning at which one arrives by dint of mystical effort and whose clarification resolves all the ambiguities of mundane existence.
Right, and basically understanding the meaning of Rus presupposes understanding large portions of Japanese culture and worldview. In frame semantic terms, the concept Rus presupposes a frame consisting of much of Japanese culture. Examples of this type can also be found closer to home. For example, a translator dealing with a 20th century German philosophical work writes about the term Bilden. Bilden is translated by culture and related forms such as cultivated. The term has the flavor of the late 18th and 19th centuries and played a key role throughout German-speaking Europe. That is, Bilden is profiled against a frame of the culture of the German intellectual elite stretching back almost 2 centuries.
Yes, in other words, the reason that words such as Rus and Bilden are untranslatable is because of the culture-specific character of frame or base against which the concept is profiled. Translating Rus as feeling or meaning or Bilden as culture approximates the profile of the concept but does not have the same frame at all.
Now 2.4. Extensions of the basic profile, frame or domain distinction. The distinction between profile and domain or frame is a fundamental one in the theory of semantics used in cognitive linguistics. It has nevertheless proved to be insufficient in itself to capture a number of important semantic phenomena, and the basic theory has been elaborated in several directions.
Now 2.4.1 Locational and configurational profiles. One extension of the frame semantic model recognizes two different kinds of profiles. Consider space domain. The concept like rectangle is profiled in the space domain. Note that an octagon is an octagon wherever it is located in space. What matters for the profile of rectangle is simply the number and configuration of line segments forming the sides. The profile for rectangle contrasts with the profile of a spatial concept such as here. Here profiles a location in space, one that is defined with respect to the position of the speaker. You cannot move the profile location without changing the concept. The same constraint applies to a concept like Mount Tamalpais. This concept also profiles a location in space. Another mountain in another location is not, nor ever will be Mount Tamalpais in contrast to mountain, which is topographical configuration that can be located anywhere. These are two different kinds of profiles. Rectangle has a configurational profile, and here or Mount Tamalpais has a locational profile.
Now here, Langacker argues that the locational configurational distinction applies to domains, but Klausner and Croft demonstrate that the same domain can support locational and configurational profiles. Now, not every frame or domain can support both kinds of profiles. Color words, for example, specify regions in the hue scale. If one moves to a different location on the hue scale, then the concept changes. For example, from red to yellow. But there is no configurational profile on the hue scale. This is not a fact about all one-dimensional scalar domains. For example, the domain of musical pitch has both locational and configurational profiles. For example, the particular notes such as C sharp, or more precisely one specific note such as C hash, the C sharp and augmented octave above middle C, that's C hash, profiles a single location on the pitch scale. However, a musical interval such as octave has a configurational profile. An octave is an octave wherever it occurs as long as the pitch interval is correct. Klausner and Croft. More generally, measurable one-dimensional scalar domains such as pitch, length, and so on allow for both locational and configurational profiles.
Now, antronymic adjectives such as tall or short profile a particular location or direction on a scalar domain. Units of measurement on the scale such as inch or foot profile configurations. An inch is the same interval no matter the locations subsumed under the measured interval.
Now 2.4.2, Scope of Prediction. In 2.2, we used the example of knees, demonstrating that its proper definition presupposes the system of kinship relations. But we do not need the entire kinship system in order to understand the concept of knees, bhatiji. Only a small part of it is necessary as represented in figure 2.2. The gender-neutral square symbol is used because the intervening kin for niece may be male or female. Niece, and then above it, 2 squares.
Now the relevant part of the kinship system for defining niece is called the scope of prediction for the concept, Langacker in 1987, and renamed immediate scope by Langacker in 1999. Now an example of different scopes of prediction can be found in the behavior of human body parts, such as the following parts of the arm: knuckle, finger, hand, arm, body. Each one has its immediate successor as its scope of prediction.
Now, possessive constructions referring to wholes within the scope of prediction are acceptable. But if the whole is beyond the scope of prediction, then the sentence is odd.
Now 18a. A body has 2 arms. B. A hand has 5 fingers. C. A finger has 3 knuckles and a fingernail. D. An arm has 5 fingers. E. A body has 28 knuckles.
Right, nested scopes of predictions can be generalized to nesting of frames or domains in general. Now 2.4.3, relationships between domains. Much more complex is the elaboration of the relationships among the domains. Not surprisingly, since this touches on the organization of human knowledge in the mind. An important fact about profiles and frames or domains is that one can have successive chains of profile-frame relations. The concept radius can only be understood in terms of circle as noted above, but the concept circle can itself only be understood in terms of 2-dimensional space. That is, the word circle profiles circle, the concept, against the space frame. In other words, a concept that functions as a frame or domain for other concepts is itself a profile for another conceptual frame or domain. In other words, Whether it's a conceptual structure is the profile or frame or domain is a matter of construal.
Now the chain of profile-frame relations does eventually bottom out when we reach directly embodied human experience. Space is a good candidate for a directly embodied human experience. Langacker calls domains rooted in directly embodied human experience as basic domains. He calls non-basic domains abstract domains. A major theme of Lakoff and Johnson's cognitive linguistic research is that even our most abstract knowledge is ultimately grounded in directly embodied human experience.
Right. Other examples of basic domains besides space and material, time, force, and a host of perceptual and bodily sensations like color, hardness, loudness, hunger, pain, etc. Now there are also emotional and other mental states and processes, and also social properties, relations and processes that do not presuppose other domains. Exactly which mental and social domains are basic depends on one's theory of mind and social interaction. And so we will not make any specific proposals here.
Now the relation between an abstract domain and the basic domain it presupposes is not a taxonomic relation, or as Langacker calls such relations, a schematic one. It is a relationship of concept to background assumption or presupposition. This distinction is sometimes obscured by the English language. For example, the word shape as a mass noun stands for the domain, but as a count noun, a shape, it is a more general or schematic concept, subsuming circle, square, triangle, and so on. A more general or schematic concept is not the domain for the particular concept. In fact, a schematic concept is itself profiled in the same domain as its instantiation. As will be seen below, it is not always easy to distinguish a taxonomic relation from a profile domain relation.
Now, Langacker argues that some domains involve more than one dimension. An obvious case is space, which involves 3 dimensions. Some concepts, such as circle, need only 2 dimensions for their definition. Others, such as line, need only 1. Many physical qualities that are grounded in the experience of sensory perception, such as temperature and pitch, are one-dimensional. Others, such as color, can be divided into hue, brightness, and saturation. Generally, dimensions of a domain are simultaneously presupposed by concepts profiled in that domain. This is the critical point. A concept may presuppose several different dimensions at once.
In fact, a concept may presuppose or be profiled in several different domains. For example, a human being must be defined relative to the domains of physical objects, living things, and volitional agents, and several other domains, for example, emotion. The combination of domains simultaneously presupposed by a concept such as human being is called a domain matrix.
Now, Langacker makes the important point that there is in principle only a difference of degree between dimensions of a domain and domains in a matrix. In practical, we are more likely to call a semantic structure a domain if there are a substantial number of concepts profiled relative to that structure. If there are few, if any, concepts profiled relative to that structure alone, but instead there are concepts profiled relative to that structure and another one, then those structures are likely to be called 2 dimensions of single domain. Now, the term domain implies a degree of cognitive independence not found in a dimension.
Now, the domain structure presupposed by a concept can be extremely complex. Let us now consider how one would define what seems to be a kind of physical object, the letter T. It is directly defined as a letter of the alphabet. Its base or domain is hence the alphabet. The alphabet is itself an abstract domain presupposing the notion of a writing system. It is not just an instance of a writing system, since the letter evolves not just a set of symbols such as an alphabet, but also the means of putting them together, including the direction of letters on a page, spaces for words, and so on. The domain of writing systems in turn presupposes the activity of writing. The activity of writing must be defined in terms of human communication, which presupposes the notion of meaning, perhaps a basic domain, since the symbolic relation appears not to be reducible to some other relation, and visual sensations, since writing is communication via visually perceived inscriptions rather than auditorily or through gestures, and since writing is an activity, the domains of time and force or causation, both basic domains, are also involved in the domain matrix of writing. Since the letter T is the product of an activity, since writing is a human activity, it presupposes the involvement of human beings. Human beings are living things with mental abilities such as volition, intention, cognition, and emotion, themselves the dimensions of mental domain or better domains in the matrix of the domain of the mind. Living things in turn are physical objects endowed with life. Physical objects possess material existence and are spatial entities. Although material objects always have a spatial extent, spatial objects like geometric figures can exist without material embodiment.
Now, a diagram exhibiting all of the basic abstract domain relations presupposed in defining the concept of the letter T is given in figure 2.3 based on Croft 1993. The profile concept is given in boldface and the basic domains are given in capitals. So T goes to alphabet and alphabet goes to writing system. Writing system goes to writing. Now writing is of two types, communication and vision. Now communication is of three types. Two of them are profile concepts. Domains, basic domains. So basic domains are given in capitals. Time and force are basic domains. So and the other thing is human beings. Time, force, and human beings, they form the part of communication. Now human beings is divided into living things and mind. Now living things are divided into life and physical objects. Now physical objects are divided into matter and space. And then space goes back to the alphabet. So that's the domain structure underlying the concept of the letter T.
Now from this, it can be seen that it is incorrect to describe the concept of the letter T simply as belonging to the domain of writing as a typical informal theory of domains which would most likely have it. Now the vast majority of concepts belong to abstract domains, which are themselves profiled in complex domain matrices, often also abstract, and so ultimately presuppose a large array of basic domains that can be called a domain structure by Croft in 1993. This corresponds to Langaker's maximal scope by Langaker in 1999. Now, it is not easy to distinguish profile-based relations from taxonomic or schematic relations, that is, type versus instance. For example, is writing an instance of human communication, or is writing an instance of an activity that can only be understood in terms of the goals of human communication? Now, figure 2.3 assumes that the latter is more accurate description. Likewise, since writing is an instance of human activity does not appear as its domain, but the various domains that it presupposes like time, change, force, volition, they do appear because anything presupposed by a human activity will be presupposed by any instance of it.
Yes, and it is also difficult to determine direct versus indirect reference to a domain. The definition of an arc does not directly presuppose two-dimensional space, but rather it presupposes a circle, which in turn presupposes two-dimensional space. Thus, an arc is not directly a two-dimensional object per se, but only such by virtue of being a part of a circle. Likewise, the letter T is not directly a shape, but only such by virtue of being a letter of the alphabet. But in fact, is the letter T a shape by virtue of being a letter of the alphabet, or by virtue of being the physical product of the activity of writing? Now, figure 2.3 assumes that it is best described as the former, since the set of symbols is a set of shapes.
Yes, and another similar problem in this example is the location of the domain of mental ability. The activity of writing is a volitional, intentional activity, so it presupposes the domain of mental ability. But mental ability is presupposed by writing because writing presupposes human involvement, and the human involvement involves volition and intention. Determining the exact structure of the array of domains upon which a profiled concept is based requires a careful working out of the definitions of concepts.
Now, a further complication in the relation between profiles and domain matrices is that a word sometimes profiles a concept in only one of the domains in the domain matrix, or even just a domain deeply nested in the domain structure. The contrast can be illustrated by the concepts like person and body.
Yes, right. Person is profiled against the abstract domain of human being, along with man, woman, etc. The concept of human being is in turn profiled against the domain matrix of living thing plus mind. Human beings are living things with certain mental states and abilities. Now recall the classical definition of man as a rational animal. A living thing is in turn profiled against the domains of physical object and life. Living things are physical objects endowed with life. The concept body represents a person's physical reality, alive or dead. Its space is nevertheless still the abstract domain of human being, or more precisely animal, but it profiles just the physical object domain in the domain structure underlying human beings. Contrast body with soul.
Like contrast body with soul, which profiles a non-physical domain of human being. What we have called mind for convenience, or with corpse, which profiles the physical object domain but also profiles a particular region in the life domain, namely death.